for our history group. Sherry Levy is out of town today. So today we have Gary Prager. He received his education in the United Kingdom and had a lifelong passion for studying English history. He also dedicated many years to researching the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and has delivered numerous presentations on this topic. As a matter of fact, today is the 80th anniversary of the Auschwitz liberation. Gary is a former chair of the politics and current events groups at Rollins College and has also taught courses as a lifelong institute of learning. His topics have included the life of Sir Winston Churchill, the House of Windsor, the English Civil War, the House of Stuart, and the decline of the British Empire from 1946 to 1966. Today, he will be presenting on the topic of industrial workers of the world and radical movements at the beginning of the 20th century. So on behalf of the History Group of the University Club, Winter Park, I take a great pleasure to introduce Gary Prager. Gary?
Good morning, everyone. Excuse me, I was getting over a cough the last week, so if I get a bit throaty now and again, hopefully you will excuse that. I'd like to welcome you all here for our topic on the industrial workers of the world, or the Wobblies, as they were affectionately known as, and still are, by the few members who still exist in the Union in this country and other parts of the world. But before we begin, as Ovid rightfully pointed out, today is the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Russian army in 1945. And so before we begin, I think it would be a nice thing to have a few seconds silence for that event and for the victims of that event. Thank you. Okay, so let's begin. So this is going to be a talk. Of course, unfortunately, I'm limited to 45 minutes or so, and I know Ovid is going to hopefully keep me in line. In fact, I'm going to take my watch off so I have something to refer to as well as the clock. This is going to be a talk about the beginnings of radicalism in the United States from 1877 to 1917, the growth and the beginnings too of the trade union movements around the country, this country, the reason why they started, the impact that they had, not just above upon the workers that they represented, but also the impact that it had in their eyes, the negative impact to the owners of industry, of manufacturing, the management levels, bosses of all kinds, who saw trade unionism as a threat to the economy of the United States at a time, of course, when the economy of the United States was booming. So in order to understand this from the beginning, it's a good idea to look at the economic changes that existed in this country, in the United States, from 1877 through to the entry of the US into the First World War, or the Great War as it was commonly known as in the UK, in 1917. And this period transformed the United States into the world's leading industrial nation. It took some time, but of course by the end of the First World War, America was for the most part the world's leading industrial nation in the world, certainly as far as the economic spread of the country, and really with the exception of Germany and of course the leader, the United Kingdom, which was kind of declining by that point, America was on the upsurge. Now, after the Civil War in this country, Americans generally shifted their energies from agriculture to the move to industry. And I was thinking this the other day when we had the inauguration of the current president, Donald Trump, and the song that was sung by Carrie Underwood, the country and western singer, of America the Beautiful. Now this of course has an amazing set of lyrics, but it also is mythical in the sense that at the very beginning, the first verse deals with, and I'll quote here, oh beautiful for spacious skies, of ambers, of grain, waves of grain, of purple mountains, majesty beneath the fruited plain. This was the ideal, but it wasn't actually the practicality by the middle of the 19th century, because what had happened, Americans were shifting their work placings and energies away from agriculture to industry. And in this case, it dealt with, for the most part, the building of steel mills, digging coal, packing meat, building cities. And so this general move away from agriculture led to the following facts. In 1870, 1 in 4 Americans in this country lived in urban areas. By 1900, 2 in 5 lived in the urban areas. And by 1920, half of the population of the United States had moved away from agriculture to the big cities and to the other urban areas. So there was a general trend moving. Now, industrial corporations in this country, along with other combinations of businesses and so on, expanded. And by 1904, there were 318 industrial groups in the United States with a total capital of over $7 billion. This came to a head in 1901 when J.P. Morgan, the famous J.P. Morgan, bought Andrew Carnegie's Iron and Steel Corporation and other holdings and created his own Federal Steel Company. Later on, of course, it was changed the name to U.S. Steel. And this became the first billion-dollar corporation in the history of the United States. Now, this increase in wealth, however, did not alleviate overall poverty in the United States. The wealth came, in the opinion of many of the workers who had moved away from agriculture to the big cities, came at the expense of themselves, came at the expense of their bargaining power. And in a sense, this was not helped by the fact that many of the workers who had been working in agriculture and had then moved to industry in the big cities, had come from family and historical backgrounds that were rooted in Europe, where they knew about the economic deprivations that their ancestors, or maybe even some of their living members, had suffered. And they also knew about the unions that had been formed in Europe and the attempts by management and ownership to smash those unions. By the end of the 19th century, conflicts of labor in the mining industry, primarily with mining companies, and resulted in state-authorized troops, or National Guard as they were called, to move in and break up any kind of demonstration against the combinations of the industries in those areas. Many of these miners, as I said, came from from Europe, and many came from the United Kingdom and Wales, because those two parts of the UK had a long history of mining development. And so the American owners of the mining companies, primarily in the West and the Midwest and the West rather, the owners of those companies knew that if they wanted to get skilled laborers, people that actually knew about the industry, the best ones to get were those from Europe, England and Germany in particular. Many of these miners, of course, had experience, and they also brought of unionizing, and they brought this experience of unionizing to the United States. They were heavily influenced at the time by the writings of Karl Marx, who of course is famous for writing Das Kapital, where he lays out this utopian vision of a working class domination working class usurpation of what he considered to be the unfair and unforgivable practices of capitalism. And as well as Karl Marx, also heavily influenced by his one-time friend and partner in the philosophy, Joseph Engels. In 1886, the American Federation of Labor was founded to represent workers around the United States, the AFL. This name, of course, was changed later on to the AFL-CIO in the 1930s, which, of course, it's still called by. It was led by a man by the name of Samuel Gompers, who, except for 1 year, because they used to have elections every year, except for 1 year, was elected leader of the AFL from 1886, when it was founded, until his death many years later in 1924. He was the only head that the union knew. One of the problems, though, that the unions had, and this is where we get into the industrial workers of the world, or the I.W.W., one of the issues that the unions did not deal with, pardon me for a second, okay, was the representation of everyone under a single banner of policy. So trade unions in this country then, and even today to a great part, were successors of the guilds that had existed in Europe in the Middle Ages, and in fact right up until proper unionisation that took place in England in the 1830s and 40s. And what this did was, and even today the case is still the same, unions represented their members and the trades or professions that they took part in. There wasn't one union for everybody. So if you were a goldsmith, you were represented by a goldsmith's guild or a carpenter's guild. And so the American union system was based upon this policy of representing just the members of the trade that those particular members worked in. One group, however, and I'm going to talk about them later, was excluded, was the black labour force, or the Negroes as they were referred to. Just as a point of record, when I say Negroes, I'm not using that in a pejorative term. That was how they would have been referred to at that time, which of course was the common expression used for people of colour, black people in this country, up until the 1960s. And so the name, when I use that word, please don't get offended. So this concept of one big union was introduced by this new organisation called the Industrial Workers of the World, or the Wobblers. They came up with this idea that all workers should exist as a social class to supplant capitalism and wage labour with one industrial democracy. In other words, and you hear this phrase mentioned even today, we are all in it together, we all share same ideals, similar aims, similar hopes, and we need one union to represent everyone, regardless of race, regardless of sex, regardless of religion, and most importantly of all, regardless of class. They did not believe in a class-based structure. So the idea of elite unions representing elite workers, as existed in America then, would be eradicated. Everybody would belong to the one union. In the year 1904, and you can see the copy of it there, a man by the name of Abner E. Woodruff brought out a pamphlet called The Evolution of Industrial Democracy. This, you could say, was a manifesto for what became the industrial workers of the world. And it pointed out all of the things that I've already mentioned, and at that time, it actually influenced another famous person who was in the labour movement, but on a different level. He was a socialist, because as I said, there were socialists, Marxists, communists didn't exist at that time, even social democrats. I mean, the union was a big tent. The philosophy of trade unionism covered a lot of thoughts. No, there we go. Eugene Debs. Well, Eugene Debs was the leader of the Socialist Party of America, and Eugene Debs had run unsuccessfully as a candidate for President of the United States. More about him later on. What is interesting about Eugene Debs is that until the appearance many, many years later of Ross Perot if you recall him, Ross Perot, at the time of Bill Clinton, who ran as an independent candidate. He was the only third-party candidate that was really, truly successful when it came to elections in this country. In fact, he garnered over 1 million votes in his first election campaign. And later on, of course, he was imprisoned. We will talk about this. And even ran from prison as a candidate for President of the United States. In the book that I mentioned prior to this, there was a coloured engraving, as you can see there, and this engraving had the title, Pyramid of the Capitalist System. Now, if you look at this, you can see at the very top, there's a bag of gold, okay, with the dollar signs all over it. That's capitalism. And then we go down the list, okay. And of course, you see underneath, you've got the king and the church, and it says, we rule you. And underneath them, we've got others who are also pontificating with the sign, we fool you. And then the military, of course, we basically do the same thing, and so on to the rich and landed class who are sitting just one from the bottom, who are, of course, engaging in high spirits and drinking and wearing tuxedos and so on. They're living the rich life. And at the bottom, of course, we have the working class. There's a man there holding a shovel. Those people at the bottom of the pyramid are holding them all up. And the subtitle says, we feed you. Because, of course, they were the ones that were producing. And the object, the comment was, this is what it represented, this piece of artwork, how the labor classes were effectively the ones who were, in fact, the producers and the saviors of the country, who were being exploited by the capitalist system. Now, moving along. There we go. This is probably the man who was the most influential person in the creation and the success of what was the industrial workers of the world. A man with the name of Bill Haywood, or Big Bill Haywood, as he was known as. He was a founding member of the I.W.W, and he was also a member of the Socialist Party of America. He campaigned in the year 1908 in Eugene Debs's presidential campaign, which of course was unsuccessful. But Debs was so impressed with Big Bill Haywood that he called him the Abraham Lincoln of Labor. That was the name he gave to him. He was central, Bill Haywood, in the split between the Socialist Party of America, which had a pretty big following at that time, and Debs was, of course, the leader of that, and the I.W.W, the Industrial Workers of the World. The Socialist Party of America believed in political action. Political action. If you want to get things done, we can do it. We can liaise between us as the working class and the politicians, because nothing can get done without the politicians. So we can be your spokesperson. The I.W.W, however, believed in direct action. They didn't believe in dealing with politicians. This was the same throughout their entire existence for the most part, even when they were at the height of their membership. They wanted, the I.W.W, a revolution. Haywood was maybe the second most famous socialist in the United States, with the exception of Debs, in the first half of the 20th century. He was originally a miner, came from a very poor family, before becoming a cowboy in the Midwest, steering horses and cattle and so on, and then returning back to mining. He became a trade union organizer, and as a founder of the Industrial Workers of the World, he believed that all people should join the I.W.W. The non-working people, unlike the other unions, in particular the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, unlike them, he also welcomed non-workers. There was, however, one exception to joining the I.W.W, and that was if you were the owner or the boss of any company, you couldn't join the I.W.W. It was open to everybody else except owners and bosses. And bosses, of course, meant people in upper management, not mid-level management, vice presidents and so on, below the actual ownership level. He wanted a union based on non-class status, and he called this industrial socialism. That's what he was aiming for. He deferred with the Karl Marx view, on the other hand, that Marx had espoused that only violent revolution would bring about a change to society. He did not want violent revolution. He believed in non-violent demonstrations. He believed in speeches made in public, but the actual Marxian view of violent revolution he did not agree to. What he did agree to, though, with Marx was an end to capitalism as practiced in the United States and, in fact, around the world. He thought of himself as a global revolutionary movement. Now, early US socialism, unlike that espoused by the I.W.W. or the Wobblers, was very clear. It wanted a utopian approach, i.e., we don't like what we see and we just want to get out of the whole system. We want to leave the system, we don't like what we see. So now there was a new focus on class struggle that the I.W.W. had introduced that veered away somewhat from the classical socialist commentaries of Marx, Engels, and others around the world. And so in 1911, Hayward, along with a man by the name of Bill Bowl, published a book called Industrial Socialism, where he laid out all of his desires. And the main comment in the book, this book, the Industrial Socialism, was that the whole fabric of capitalism is fast disintegrating all over the world, and we need to be here to step in, change the situation, and spread our message to other countries worldwide, because this disintegration was not really benefiting everybody. In the USA at the time, at the beginning of the last century, 30 million people worked for other people, and according to Hayward, he said that of these 30 million, 2/3 of what they produced, basically, were given to the bosses, and they were lucky if they got 1/3. So in other words, they were saying that even with their wages and their work and the hours that they put in, incidentally, working hours were not restricted as they would later be in many cases, especially in the mining industry. People were working 7 days a week, 14 hours a day, with maybe 2 or 3 hours of rest, and this was a never-ending cycle. And he said, these people have no control or influence over the conditions of their labor, where they should work, how they should work, or what kind of leisure they should be given. And these things he believed needed to be changed. He said also that the great wealth of the USA had been created by the toilers alone and had been wasted by the idlers in industry. And he called the idlers the capitalists. So the workers were working while the capitalists were idling. The working people, he said, are, quote, sweating and starving and dying while the others are living high on the hog. So it was very clear where Hayward and his political belief stood. In particular, he was very, very concerned about the working conditions and the need for child labor. Now, child laborers, especially in the mining districts, were working 14 hours a day at the ages of 6 or 7. They were forced to go down the mines because there were certain jobs that needed to be done in the depth of the mine that only people with small hands, who of course were children, they were able to get and maneuver into small crevices and so on could do. Hayward said that if you were born into a working class family and had even saved up enough money to open a shop or start a small business, you were nevertheless, he said, bound to fail. Finally, he said this: socialism, and this was in his book, by the way, socialism is a message of hope. It is addressed to the working classes. It will solve the problems of the working class, or rather show the working class how to save itself. And this is what he and other members of the I.W.W. believed. He said that the despair of the worker helped the capitalist and the owners within the free enterprise system, as it removed workers' confidence and power. Humans, he said, need hope, and the I.W.W. is the solution. Now, let's move on. Clarence Darrow. Now, how does he fit into all of this? Clarence Darrow, the famous attorney in America, the man who defended, for the most part, people who had no hope. He defended murderers, he defended other people. You know, he was always the defense attorney. And interestingly enough, he's known, of course, for the famous Scopes monkey trial, amongst other trials, the Leopold and Loeb trial in the 1920s, when the two youths from the fancy universities decided for thrills to kidnap a person from the streets who happened to be a young Jewish boy and kill him for pleasure in the hope that they could get away with it, which of course they didn't. And it seemed as though they were caught banks to rights, as they say in England. But of course Darrow was able to get both Leopold and Loeb off of being convicted to be executed, and then they spent many, many years in prison. Now, where he comes into the story was that at the time of Haywood's involvement in the Union, there had been a trial of Haywood which involved his attorney, Clarence Darrow, because in 1907, the governor, the former governor of Ohio, was leaving his house one morning and he was blown up by a bomb and killed, blown to, into pieces. His house, half of his house was destroyed, and it was believed at the time that this was done by the I.W.W., but the I.W.W. was not the only anti-capitalist type movement. There were other movements as well. Primarily, of course, the anarchists. There was a big anarchal movement here in the United States, and what the anarchists wanted to do is they just wanted to get rid of the entire American economic system and just replace it with something else. And so they did these things, the anarchists did, by using violent means, and nobody was looking at the anarchists. They just happened to look at the, Bill Haywood and his, his people. Haywood was charged, of being involved in 15 years of bombings against industrial buildings, offices, and bombings of individuals. He was also charged with 15 years, at the same length of time that he'd been doing this for 15 years, of denying people their liberty by harassing them and by forcing them out of town, anybody that disagreed with them, and to make things even worse for Haywood, the prosecutors, which happened to be the state, had hired Pinkerton's agency to find out whether any of this was true. And they believed it all was true. So eventually, of course, he's placed on trial. And one of the players on behalf of the prosecution against Bill Haywood was a man by the name of James McParland, who was the most famous detective in the United States at that time. Just as an aside, what makes McParland even more interesting was that the last book that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote about Sherlock Holmes, his famous series of novels about Holmes, was called The Valley of Fear. That was the last book featuring Sherlock Holmes. And he included in this fourth and final book of the detective, one of the characters in there was named James McParland. He actually named one of his characters after McParland, which was, of course, a huge honor for McParland to be included in this famous book. But it shows you that the interest that people had in him. The prosecution also brought to the table in the trial, this is before Darrow even stands up, a man by the name of Henry Orchard. Now, Henry Orchard was America's most notorious murderer. He had been acquitted for 7 offences of murder, so he was called as an expert witness, and he said that Haywood and these other I.W.W/Wobbly individuals had hired him to basically plan, not necessarily carry out, he didn't admit to killing him, but certainly plan the murder of the governor, Stuenberg, and for this, of course, he was given legal immunity. But his case was blown to pieces, and Darrow, of course, steps in, and he has the trial, and fortunately enough, Darrow was able to get Haywood acquitted. What they did find out later on, though, was that the main prosecution witness, as I pointed out, they found out later that he was offered $200 a day to give evidence by the state, and also if he was able, through his evidence, to secure a conviction against Haywood, that the state would give him a ranch, a 1,500-acre ranch, as a gift from the state, where he could then retire from his fancy life of crime and become, the wealthy landowner rancher. Now, Collier magazine at the time was so impressed with the defense that Darrow had put up, which was even more remarkable when one considers that the state called 200 witnesses against Haywood, whereas Darrow called 3. They were so impressed, Collier magazine, that they called him the most remarkable legal mind that has ever appeared in an American court of justice. It was after this event that Haywood became a target for the authorities, even though he was acquitted of the murder of the former governor, or certainly involvement in the murder. And we now move forward. Oh, sorry. I'm so bad at that. Woodrow Wilson. World War II broke out on the 4th of August, 1914. And the President of the United States at the time, Woodrow Wilson, entered Congress 3 days later and declares that America will remain neutral. America will not enter the war to assist the British or any other foreign power across the Atlantic on the other side in a war which he felt and did say brought no benefit at all to the United States of America. And he said, the US, I'm quoting him here, the US, quote, has no interest in getting mixed up in this foreign drama. That's what he said. And of course, America stayed out of the war. On the other hand, what the United States did do is they did supply weapons and armory and other material to the allies of America who were fighting the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. And that included things like ships, guns, rifles, whatever, trucks, whatever was needed. And indirectly, of course, it benefited America's economy, directly and indirectly, because, of course, while all this is going on and there's no loss of American blood on foreign soil, the American economy is improving. In 1916, 2 years later, President Wilson runs for re-election on the slogan of the party, quote, "He kept us out of this war." That's what he ran on, and that's how he was re-elected. On April the 9th, 1917, President Wilson addressed a joint session of Congress, this is just a year later or so, and made a declaration of war against Germany, in effect refuting the promises he had made a year earlier that he would keep America out of the war. He said, quote, "The world must be made safe for democracy." He also used the defense of humanitarianism and democratic principles in making that decision. Now, why did America enter the war? Well, of course, there had been German U-boat attacks on neutral ships, particularly American cargo ships, crossing the Atlantic to the United Kingdom and other parts of the world. There had also been what later became known as the Zimmermann telegram, where supposedly, it was never actually proven, but supposedly a German ambassador, a diplomat rather, by the name of Zimmermann, had sent a telegram to the president of Mexico, promising that if Mexico entered the war on behalf of Germany, in the event that Germany, and they were confident of that, in the event that Germany was victorious, then Mexico would be given back colonies that had been taken from it by the United States in the 19th century. So that would have included Texas, California. I mean, you know what they were, huh? Wilson was also interested in being involved because he believed that the Allies would win against Germany and Austria-Hungary. He was also interested in being involved in the post-war peace process, which of course he eventually was with the Versailles Peace Conference. And lastly, but importantly, America's connections to allies in the war effort, primarily Great Britain. Great Britain were buddies with the United States then, just as they are now. 4 days after Wilson's speech to Congress, because Congress only could declare war, Congress declares war, and the vote in the Senate was 82 for and 6 against. The vote in the House was 373 for joining the war, with 50 against. So 56 politicians between the House of Representatives and the Senate voted against the American involvement in the First World War in 1917. So who were the people against World War I? First of all, of course, pacifists, who were totally against any involvement in any kind of war. These people still exist for religious reasons, moral reasons, or other reasons. Second, of course, the socialists. They were against America's involvement. German immigrants, they didn't want their hometowns and cities where they had come from way back when being attacked and bombed or whatever. Anarchists, women's groups known as suffragettes, and the suffragettes actually played a very major part in this. Along with the I.W.W, they were the last group that were against being involved in the war. But the suffragettes, the day after the war was declared, paraded around the White House lawn, outside the White House rather, you know, where the public were allowed to stand, with the following poster, quote, Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the Germans because they are not self-governed? 20 million women in this country are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eye and do something about the women's rights before you worry about fighting a foreign war in a foreign land. So there was a lot of anti-war sentiment in this country, and as a result of this, Woodrow Wilson set up an organization, a committee, which was called the Committee on Public Information. This was a propaganda exercise. Just one moment. There you can see some posters that were published by the committee. Not as well known today as Uncle Sam Needs You. I was going to include that, but I thought these were more important. You can see on the left there, enlist as a volunteer, men 21 years old. Of course, there wasn't a draft. Everybody was supposed to volunteer. But look at the two next to it. Destroy this mad brute. Now, this is, of course, allegorical. You see a gorilla with his mouth open and his fangs bared, holding a cudgel with a young, presumably virgin type girl in his arms, and he's about to rape her. But if you look closely, this is not an attack against people of colour, it's an attack against Germans, because he's wearing a German helmet. So the gorilla represents Germany, raping and plundering with the club, and threatening the very virtue of women, young women, not just around the world, but presumably, if he wins the war, he's going to come here and do that to you too. The purpose of this propaganda was to manipulate and form public opinion against war dissent. And in order to restrict dissent, there were two acts that were passed, which affected directly all unions, but more so the industrial workers of the world, and you know, their leaders, Bill Haywood and others across the country. One thing I didn't mention to you, most of the I.W.W. members came from the West and the Midwest, okay, where of course they worked in mines, they were loggers and so on. And others, of course, came from the deep South, here in Florida, where there was a lot of, you know, tree clearing and so on, also logging. Turpentine was a big industry here in Florida at that time, and they needed trees to produce turpentine. It comes from the tree. And so in order to restrict this dissent, Woodrow Wilson passes the Espionage Act in 1917. This act said, quote, "It is a crime for any person to convey information intended to interfere with the US Armed Forces efforts. Also, any kind of protest of the draft or to encourage men not to enlist in the military, okay, will be punishable by a fine of up to $10,000 and or 20 years imprisonment." Now, 1,500 people were arrested across the country within 6 months under the Espionage Act and were tried. 250 of them went to prison. Many of them were, of course, you know, fined large amounts of money. Not the whole $10,000, but thousands of dollars they clearly couldn't pay, including Bill Haywood. Most of them that got off, of course, had their careers ruined or their businesses ruined. They could never go back to work as workers. And it eventually ended up in the High Court, in the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court ruled that freedom of speech was guaranteed by the First Amendment of the Constitution. So what was there preventing people under the Espionage Act that Wilson had passed from declaring viewpoints about the war or anything else? And many of those sentences were overturned. 6 months after the sentences were overturned, okay, President Wilson, once again, in his wisdom, passes what was known as the Sedition Act of 1918. Now, there had been a Sedition Act passed in this country in the 18th century, just after the American Revolution, which, of course, made it very difficult for people who wanted to not only be spies, but spread, you know, bad propaganda or whatever about the newly formed United States. But the Sedition Act of 1918 made it, quote, and here is where everything changes, a crime to say or to write or to communicate to crowds or assemblies anything disloyal, profane, or abusive about the government and the war effort. So it became a crime to do those things, effectively shutting down free speech. Another thing that was done by this particular act was to enable post offices throughout the country to deny the postage of mail to organizations that the postmasters declared to be unpatriotic. So an organization like the I.W.W., which was considered a troublemaker anyway to begin with, they were prevented from sending any kind of literature to any of their members' branches around the country and so on. Not working, sorry. You froze up. You'll have to just talk. Sorry, but the slides froze up. The activities of the unions, though, did carry on, and Hayward and others within the I.W.W. now focused their attention during this period on the condition and very hard working conditions of black workers in the United States. This applied mainly to the lumber industry in the South. In 1910, before the First World War, of the 210,000 workers in the southern lumber industry, over half of them were black, 50%. They were very unskilled in the lowest paying jobs. Wages to them were justified by the Texas and the Florida lumber companies on the basis of, quote, I'm quoting here, "There is a limit to wages that can be paid with safety to Negro laborers around the world, and especially in sawmills. Too much pay causes discontent and idleness amongst Negro workers." The I.W.W. said that emancipation, however, from slavery had not improved the lot of the Negro worker. He had just, according to Bill Hayward, exchanged his lot for a different system of economic bondage. Union dissidents were jailed for any kind of, black union members were jailed for any kind of action against the companies, and sheriffs in the state of Florida were authorized by the governor of Florida at the time to jail black lumber workers who were considered to be troublemakers. Now, this has an interesting sideline, because while they were in jail, the sheriffs used to hire out the black laborers who were in jail, for what they considered to be troublemaking, trying to get more wages, better working conditions, and so on. They were hired out by the sheriff's departments across the state of Florida, back to the lumber companies. And they took a 20% commission for doing that. And so not only were they being jailed, but they were forced to go back to work and work for virtually nothing. And whatever they made, the bosses from them, the owners and so on, 20% was paid back. Wages paid to blacks in the lumber industry in Florida were as low as $1 a day, even though white workers, and the national average in this country was from $7 to $8 a day. So they were getting paid maybe as little as 1/8 of the actual wages. Blacks were forced to labor, along with whites, from 10 to 12 hours a day. Payments, however, were not paid in cash for the most part. They were made in script. And this script, of course, this is where you get the famous song, I owe my soul to the company store. This script, pieces of paper with amounts written on them, would be used and paid for goods in company-owned stores, and so on. This is the only place they could use them. And like a gift card today, they had an expiration date. So if you didn't spend them, the scripts that were given out by a certain time, you lost all the money, or if you lost the scripts. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, which I mentioned earlier on, which was the huge union in the country, run by Samuel Gompers, showed no interest in black labor at all. None. They didn't care about the black laborers or the plight of black workers generally. And of course, the I.W.W. went to the loggers and successfully persuaded workers within the loggers union of the AFL to join the industrial workers of the world. This raised what was known as the black question, and I'm quoting here. This is what Hayward said. Either the whites organize with the Negroes and the bosses, with the Negroes, or the bosses will organize the Negroes against the whites, in which case it is hardly up to the whites to quote, and I'm quoting here, damn the niggers, unquote. Southern workers ought to realise that while there are two colours among the workers in the South, there is actually only one class of workers. It is the object of the I.W.W. to teach that the only hope for the workers is through industrial organisation. 1 month after he made those comments, the loggers' unions left the American Federation of Labour Union and merged together, all of them, with the I.W.W. Finally, with the question of class, he said, Haywood, while the colours in question are two, the class in question is only one, that the first thing for a real working man to do is to learn that by a little study that he belongs to the working class, line up with the industrial workers of the world and make a start for industrial freedom. He was helped in this aim to get logging unions to join the I.W.W. by a man by the name of Covington Hall. Covington Hall had been a former member of the Ku Klux Klan, but then he had a change of heart. He had like an epiphany and totally changed his, what we would now call racist views. And he said, quote, let the Negroes come together with us, the I.W.W. If any arrests are made, least of all of you will go to jail, and at least you'll all be white and coloured people together representing the I.W.W. and everything we stand for. What Haywood did with the black workers in America and through the I.W.W. was not only did he help to represent them, whereas the regular union was not interested because of their colour, but he also helped to educate them, because the I.W.W. set up libraries and schools around the country which helped to give a form of education which had not existed before. Finally, I want to mention one other person. I want to mention Helen Keller, the famous lady who was, deaf, dumb, and blind, but also was a female activist, a suffragette. She was a socialist, as well as others like her who believed in the I.W.W. and what they stood for, and gave money to fund the I.W.W. The I.W.W. came to an end as a result, as I pointed out, of President Woodrow Wilson's attempts to smash what he saw as a threat to America's involvement in World War I. And by 1919, the I.W.W.'s membership shrunk to 200 because of the fear of arrest and imprisonment, and never really recovered. However, they still have lodges and other places of membership around this country, mainly in Chicago and other Western areas, and in the United Kingdom and in Italy. And they even have a website where you can go on there if you so wish and join the I.W.W. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and we will take some questions. Manuel, would you turn the lights on, please? Thank you. Okay, we have questions coming. Yeah, here. All right. Go ahead.
My mother joined the Ladies Garment Workers Union, and she said it was one of the best things that she ever did, because she worked in a sweatshop in New York City, which is a pretty bad place. And my uncle was actually hit over the head, and he died when they tried to break up a group that was trying to join the union.
Okay, interesting. Ed?
Good morning, Ed.
Good morning. Thank you, Gary. Interestingly, the first union was in 1794 in Philadelphia. The cordwainers, journeymen, which were shoe producers, not cobblers. Cobblers fixed shoes. They made leather goods, especially shoes. But in the early 19th century, surprisingly or not, the Lowell, Massachusetts girls' strike of 1834 and 1836, because they had to work very long shifts, 7 days a week, et cetera, and were paid very, very little. And then, there was, obviously radicalization. People probably don't know how Karl Marx wrote over 100 articles in the New York Tribune, which was one of the most influential papers in the United States, covering the Civil War, etc., and was very sympathetic to the working class, if you will. But I would take issue. Karl Marx never advocated violence. He said, he didn't prescribe it, he said that it would probably occur because the capitalist class would try to violently put down the rights of workers, but it's only Lenin who said it had to be violent. And the other thing that, is a context is people forget the economic boom-bust cycles of the 19th century that were terrible. We always only think of the Depression of the 1930s, but the depressions and recessions with huge bank failures, the wiping out of real estate values, etc., affected poor people just like it always does, more than anybody else. But they call them panics that resulted sometimes in years of economic depression in this country. So, lastly, I believe Eugene Debs tried to integrate the Pullman porters, black Pullman porters, into the railway workers, and he was opposed by all, the white unionists, and so he, in one sense, was marginalized within the workers, unions, but they were still democratic.
Right. If I could just respond quickly to your comment about the Pullman strikes, that was actually in my speech. Unfortunately, I only had an hour to present the whole thing. You're completely correct, and it actually backs up what I did say about how the other unions were not interested in allowing black people to join the union. But I do want to make one quote that Debs did say, which I didn't use in my presentation. He said the following: "The class which has the power to rob upon a large scale has also the power to control the government and legalize that very robbery." He then said, "I have no country to fight for." This was Eugene Debs. "My country is the earth, and I am a citizen of the world." Next question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Harry. Could you expand a little bit about why such an interesting organization as I.W.W. practically disappeared?
Why did it fail? Why did it go away? Well, I did mention that earlier on. One of their big downfalls, as it so happens, was that they were not interested in getting involved politically. They believed that trade unions, as existed before they came along, were more interested in supporting the aims and ambitions of their members, in many cases at the detriment of other union members. And that the only way to resolve this was to shatter he considered to be a co-conspiracy of unions with management and the bosses of industry. Now, there was a similar thing, by the way, that happened in England in the 1970s when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, where there was an internecine union strike. There was a strike of the railway unions in the United Kingdom in the 1970s that had nothing to do with the government or politics. What it had to do with the fact, well, it was semi-political, but it had to do with the fact that the government of Margaret Thatcher at that time in the UK had given a wage increase to the train drivers union, because they had their own separate union. And this, they believed, the other unions within the train industry believed that the train drivers, being at the top of the pile, so to speak, in the railway industry, had colluded with the government to get higher wages, even though they knew that workers lower down the scale were going to get the shaft.
Okay.
And that this wasn't a good thing. And so they went on strike to force the government to give the porters and the minor workers within the railway union similar wage increases to match that of the highest paid train drivers. And this is what the I.W.W. under Bill Haywood was very concerned to put an end to. He said, unless we can act as one union and not get involved politically at all, but rather represent the wishes and the long-term aims of our members, then really we're never going to get anywhere. So that's what happened. They went out of business indirectly because of their lack of political involvement. Yeah.
Okay, question.
Thank you, Gary. It was excellent. Were there any legal challenges to Woodrow Wilson's decrees?
Yes, there was a challenge. There was a challenge actually to the Sedition Act that ended up going to the Supreme Court. If you remember, I did mention the Espionage Act, which ruled against the government because they said that the Espionage Act was impeding upon free speech, which was protected under the amendments. So the Sedition Act, which followed it a year later, precluded the use of free speech during wartime, and the Supreme Court, in a majority decision, which when you think about it was extraordinary, actually backed Woodrow Wilson and his government in the full suppression of free speech during World War I, only for the duration of the war.
Thank you for choosing this subject. I was trying to read a little bit from the University of Washington has quite a large history project on the history of the Justice Campaign against the Wobblies. As a side note, I guess there are several different theories to why the Wobblies chose that name. The one that seems to make the most sense that it was related to the sawmills and the saws. So there's quite a few books and articles about that long campaign between, 1917 and 1920 of the United States. I understood that a lot of people joined the Wobblies, like you said, because they weren't allowed in the AFL, whether they were women, minorities. And many were just working in all of the mining camps, and there were continuous accidents. The largest one in Butte, Montana, I believe, at a copper mine where 167 people died in the shafts. So back to the University of Washington project, at that one point in 1917, our government under Wilson and the Justice Department and the programs developed by the CPI, they raided offices in a 24-hour period. There's a long, complicated history to the defendants and how much time many of them served at Leavenworth. But it seems, I'm talking in many different details now, but in most textbooks, we're taught I.W.W, a militant, campaign, where, yes, theoretically, the leaders may have adopted certain ideologies of militancy and bombings, but you could say that the government's reaction was as bad, if not worse, in terms of violation of, rights. And then other small details, and then I'll shut up. It is better to refer to suffragists as suffragists. The suffragettes were in England, and they were more militant.
That's how I refer to them, as suffragettes.
Right, but the American suffragists prefer to be called suffragists because they didn't use militant action. I applaud you for bringing up about the black laborers. There's vast history on the turpentine camps in the United States. Lastly, the one interesting, and this about Wilson's campaign against, primarily it was set up, I think, because the war effort needed copper so much for weapons, and that's why they went after Leather.
The logging industry was also very important to the war effort because of the laying down of sleepers, for the trains, the wooden part of the track. The tracks are laid in between wood, and that was a big issue. What I would like to recommend a book if any of you want to read further on this topic. This book has been printed many times. It's one of the few on the topic of the industrial workers of the world. I've had this for many years. You can see it's eared, dog-eared, but it's called We Shall Be All. We Shall Be All, a history of the industrial workers of the world, written by Melvin Dubofsky. You can get it on Amazon. It's not that expensive. Even eBay have copies. But it has been printed since the 1960s, This book was printed in 1966, but I do understand there are updated versions of it. What finally put an end to the, one more point, and I will take another question, but what I didn't mention, of course, was that there was a split in the I.W.W. To your earlier question, the lady, who was it who wanted to know, it was you, sir, who wanted to know why the I.W.W. faded away so quickly. There was actually a split in the movement in the 1920s within the I.W.W. where you did have two schools of thought. You had one group that wanted to agitate rather than to demonstrate violently, and the others who were the opposite. And the two parted ways. And so the I.W.W. went from an organization which for the most part was peaceful, representing its members, to an organization that said we need to be more like the Bolshevik movements, which were then, of course, springing up in Russia. That's the only way that we can achieve our aim and ambition. Yeah.
Gary, you mentioned the Zimmerman, the infamous
Zimmerman
telegram. Think of it, the Lusitania was sunk about 1915,
Yeah.
and the United States did not declare war on Germany.
Yes.
Waited 2 more years. A lot of people think that the one thing that precipitated the entrance of the United States into war was that infamous Zimmerman telegram. Interesting enough, also, the Germans sent that telegram via Western Union. That was the only thing available.
Yeah.
And supposedly it was intercepted by the British.
Yeah.
Now that's where the history gets a little bit blurry. Was intercepted or was invented or created or made up by the British in order to get the United States to cite. Now the latest information that we have is that actually it was a true telegram. It was acknowledged by the German later on that they did send that telegram to the ambassador, the German ambassador in Mexico, in hopes that Mexico will eventually receive Texas back from the United States and so forth.
Well, your comment, Ovid, about them sending it by telegram, which sounds a bit odd, why would you do that with secrecy laws and so on that probably no doubt existed in Germany, it's not that surprising for the period. I mean, just as an aside, the largest diamond in the world is the Star of Africa, which is in the crown jewels of England. It's a diamond-shaped, pear-shaped diamond that's in the scepter crown of the crown jewels. That was, of course, found in Africa at the Cullinan Diamond Mines. It was given as a gift by the Dominion of South Africa to King Edward VII on the occasion of his coronation in 1901. They didn't know how to send it. How do we send it from South Africa? They didn't want to put it on a ship because, you know, maybe somebody will find out about it and sink the ship or board it and steal the diamond. So they wrapped it up in a brown box with string and brown paper, and they sent it regular mail in the post. And if you go to the Tower of London today, where they have the exhibit of the crown jewels, in a very small corner that has no kind of publicity around it, there's no sort of signs or anything, it's just sitting there very nondescript. It is the actual package that they sent the largest diamond in the world, so maybe it was the best way to do it. Western Union.
Yeah, but it was not very secret for sure. Okay, here is one more question.
Yeah.
You've mentioned the AFL, which is an amalgamation of skilled trades.
Yes.
You haven't mentioned the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which later combined with the AFL, would seem to me to have a greater affinity with I.W.W.
Yeah.
Do they figure in this at all?
Well, I might be a year or two off. I can't remember the exact date, but I want to say it was either 1931 or 1932 that the AFL was dissolved, and it merged with the other organisations to become the AFL-CIO. So by that time, if that was the case, the international workers of the world and their influence had ended. So, you know, they weren't really part of the conversation in the 1930s.
But CIO existed as an independent organization.
Yes, it did. Yeah. One final point.
One last question here.
Incidentally,
You raised your hand.
Yeah. Edward R. Murrow was accused by President Johnson, of being a member of the I.W.W., which of course he denied. That was a slur that was used against him. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So has all this labor union business kind of dissolved because everything's now put offshore and all these horrible conditions now exist for Chinese who can't do anything about it? I mean, the Asian manufacturing is where people are being exploited now. It's just moved on.
Right.
Do you think?
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with it, you're correct, but I think the main reason for trade unions in the 19th century and early part of this century, other than, of course, they all wanted more money for their labor, nobody would have denied that. Even today, the fact that you'd work for 7 or 8 hours for $1 a day was ridiculous, and kids going down mines and so on. But I think it had a lot to do with working conditions. This was the same in the UK, the number of hours worked, time off for recreation. Incidentally, soccer in the United Kingdom, or football as we called it, was created as a sporting event by companies in the UK. And today there are many clubs, like West Ham Soccer Club is called the Hammers, because they originated from an ironworks factory where they used to give the Sundays off to the workers to play soccer, and even paid for playing fields for them to play on. That was all part of the union efforts in England, as I'm sure that they had here, to improve working conditions and recreation ability for workers across the field. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm here afterwards. If you want to have anybody wants to come up with me with any comments or questions, I'm still available here. The only other book I didn't mention, which I got from the library, which I highly recommend, which talks about the Great War, the First World War, America's involvement. Highly recommend it. It's by an author called Adam Hochschild. It's called American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace and Democracy's Crisis. And the crisis deals with President Woodrow Wilson's successful attempts to clamp down, and the administration, on freedom of speech in the United States and labor rights in general. Thank you.